Okay. No, thank you. All right. Are we all set? Okay. Good morning. I'm Linda Feldman, Washington Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Bi-khim Hsiao. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
That's right.
Taiwan's representative to the United States, also known as the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative. It's a position she has held since July of 2020. Before that, Ms. Hsiao was a senior advisor to President Tsai Ing-wen on the National Security Council of Taiwan. She's also been a politician, serving 4 terms in Taiwan's legislature, and as director of the Democratic Progressive Party International Affairs Department. Ms. Hsiao was born in Kobe, Japan, to an American mother and Taiwanese father who was a Presbyterian minister. As a teenager, she moved to Montclair, New Jersey, where she went to high school, and then on to Oberlin College in Ohio. And then from there, she came back east to Columbia University, where she earned a master's degree in political science. Ms. Hsiao likes to call herself a cat warrior, which speaks to me as a cat person. I'm going to adopt that for myself, and I want to know exactly what you mean by that. But first, there's some business to attend to, and then before that, the ground rules. We're on the record here. Please, no blogging or tweeting or live streaming, anything. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. And there's no embargo when the session ends at 10 a.m. And we will email pictures from this breakfast to all the reporters here as soon as the event concludes. As many of you know, if you would like to ask a question, please send me a signal and I will call on as many of you as time permits. Now, Ms. Hsiao, if you'd like to make brief opening remarks, the floor is yours.
Well, distinguished journalists, good morning. And I want to thank you, Linda, for having me. And I also want to thank Christian Science Monitor for organizing this gathering with all the distinguished journalists here this morning. But I must premise my remarks, though, by saying that I didn't come here to make any headlines. I came here with an intention of, under the assumption that I can cover all your questions in one shot and continue our important work of communicating with the American public as well as all those interested in Taiwan issues in my work and also in the Taiwan-U.S. partnership. It's been a tremendous honor for me to represent Taiwan here in Washington, D.C., in the United States. And despite being in the middle of a very challenging geopolitical environment, I appreciate that Taiwan's relationship with the United States has become stronger than ever in depth and in breadth. It is a relationship that has been fortified over the years because it is built on a foundation of shared values and interests. And though often characterized as officially unofficial, our common values of cherishing democracy and freedom and our shared strategic interests in peace, stability, and prosperity for our peoples make this relationship one of global significance. And I highlight these values and interests not only because they define my work here, but also because they guide the priorities in our partnership. And first, on the aspect of prosperity, some good news. We have just concluded a successful round of trade negotiations with the USTR under the U.S.-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade, and we expect to sign a trade agreement very soon. As the 8th largest trading partner of the United States, as of 2022, Taiwan hopes that this agreement will lay the groundwork for a more comprehensive agreement in the future, demonstrating our commitment to high standards in trade and opening the door to agreements with other like-minded trading partners. And this trade agreement will supplement many other economic initiatives that exist between our economies. It'll take some time to go over the entire list of all the platforms, dialogues, meetings that we have ongoing. And I will do that later if anyone is interested. But I just want to highlight that the economic partnership is a very significant one. And I truly believe that with the the talent, the technology, the innovation, the diligent workforce that we have between our two societies, we are truly force multipliers in terms of advancing global prosperity. And I must also say that, as we have seen in many of the global summits of leaders around the world, the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait is an indispensable component of global prosperity. We have seen this message repeated over and over again, and so we truly do believe that working together, advancing prosperity, not just among our societies, but we are an indispensable component of global prosperity as well. So now let me quickly turn to the issue of peace, which is critical for that prosperity to continue to flourish. Our security partnership is very important to Taiwan's continuing survival as a democracy, but also in continuing to advance our prosperity, as just mentioned. And it's no secret that we're in the midst of hybrid challenges, magnified by the growing aggressiveness of the People's Liberation Army of the People's Republic of China. We take our security seriously, and everything we are doing in our security partnership with the United States is aimed at preventing the tragedy of war and conflict from ever happening across the Taiwan Strait. So on Taiwan's side, the government is urgently fortifying our defenses in several ways, including increasing our defense budget, proactively building a domestic defense industry, reforming and enhancing our reserves, extending the conscript military training program from the current 4 months to a full year by next year, and establishing the ADMA, or the All-Out Defense and Mobilization Agency, taking a whole-of-society approach to our defense preparedness. We appreciate that these efforts are supported by our partnership with the United States within the framework of the Taiwan Relations Act. The U.S. continues to support Taiwan's self-defense through foreign military sales, as well as a number of new initiatives in the National Defense Authorization Act over the past couple years. We're also grateful that these efforts, as is the case with all of our policy initiatives with the United States, are supported in a bipartisan fashion. And although the cross-strait situation remains difficult, President Tsai intends to steer Taiwan on a steady course in turbulent waters. She has reiterated over and again her commitment to maintaining the status quo. Although this may not be completely pleasing to all parties involved, we believe that maintaining the status quo is the largest common denominator among political parties in Taiwan, across the Taiwan Strait, and also among global stakeholders. Laying out the goal of maintaining the status quo will help to ensure peace and stability despite stark systemic differences. The status quo does not imply inaction, though. We have much to do in terms of strengthening our defenses, making our democracy more resilient, and building a prosperous society for our people. We've been open to dialogue based on respect and parity across the strait. We will not provoke, but neither will we surrender to coercion that sacrifices the democratic wishes of the Taiwanese people. And one of those aspirations of the Taiwanese people involves greater international space, a desire to connect to the international community. And over the last month, we've expressed our appreciation to Secretary Blinken for once again highlighting the U.S. commitment to supporting Taiwan's inclusion in the annual World Health Assembly and in our longer-term meaningful participation in the global health institution. We also appreciate that congressional members have also raised resolutions, legislation over the years in supporting these efforts. And unfortunately, Taiwan continues to face unjust exclusion from the international system. And by exclusion, I mean not only Taiwan's government, but also our NGOs, our civil society, and our journalists are barred from a presence in the UN system. So we will continue to work vigorously despite all challenges and difficulties ahead of us to find that space for Taiwan's meaningful connection to the international community. And after all, we seek to be a force for good. The Taiwanese people are generous, are open, we have expertise, and we are eager to contribute as a force for good to the global good. So I just want to stop there in terms of highlighting some of our policy priorities, and I look forward to a meaningful conversation with all of you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll move to reporters around the room. So there's been speculation about what Beijing has learned from the war in Ukraine. So what has Taiwan learned from the war, and are you reassured by the American and more broadly Western response?
Well, I think we are all trying to take lessons from the unfortunate tragedies of Ukraine so that those tragedies will not be repeated anywhere else, especially in Taiwan. So our first and foremost priority is to take lessons that will help to fortify our continuing existence as a free and open democracy, free of coercion. Our best hope is that Beijing also takes the lesson that aggression will not succeed, that there will be tremendous international pushback against aggression. In Taiwan, we are learning from the resilience of the Ukrainian people in their will to defend, in their determination to defend their homeland. On an operational and tactical level, we are also learning about the use of some asymmetric modern systems that have supported their defenses and pushback against the invasion and against aggression.
What do you mean by that? What asymmetric measures are you talking about?
Well, ultimately, we are smaller democracies confronting some of the most powerful global militaries. And from Taiwan's perspective, in our own self-defense, we do not intend to engage in an arms race, and neither are we in a capacity to do so. And so we strongly believe that we must invest in asymmetric capabilities. And those are smaller, cost-effective, highly mobile, survivable systems that will target an invading force that will be strong enough to also deter, ultimately, any possibility of an invasion.
So can you provide an example or two of what you mean by asymmetric measures that would help? I mean, Russia versus Ukraine is one thing, but China versus Taiwan is a much more extreme example in terms of proportions. So there's the asymmetry there. So how do you fight back against that?
Well, let me first say that Taiwan is not Ukraine. We have different histories and a different strategic position in our region, but also in relationship to global security as well. So I'm not drawing the exact parallels, and ultimately the course that we intend to move is of a relationship of continuing stability in the region. We are doing everything we can to deter and to prevent any possibility of conflict. But having said that, as I said, we are looking at some of the asymmetric systems that have been deployed. Some of them are some more traditional but asymmetric systems, such as the Stingers, the Javelins. Some of them are modern technologies, the pervasive application of drones in modern warfare to an extent that has never been seen before. And so we're looking at all kinds of new modern technologies, including those unmanned systems that will further work in terms of fortifying our own self-defenses, but also in countering some of the current gray zone harassment and threats that Taiwan is experiencing, including some drone intrusions into our airspace, harassments, some of the efforts conducted by the PLA in an attempt to weaken our resolve, to sow discontent in our society. I think we are looking at how the Ukrainians have fortified in the process of resisting the invasion, also the public will to defend, as a strong message also of deterrence.
So I assume that like cyber security is a big part of
Yes. Well,
what you're doing.
well, thanks for that reminder. Yes,
Yes.
cybersecurity was too important to not mention. Cybersecurity, but also the resilience of our communication systems that we have witnessed as being a key component of Ukraine's outreach to the rest of the world. So having resilient but also redundant communication systems that will enable not only communications and connections with the world during conflict, but also in enabling our society to continue to function. I think that is also critical to our broader resilience.
Sure. No, I was thinking about cyber because in recent days, Chinese malware has hit telecommunications systems on the island of Guam, which some people see as ultimately a threat to the U.S.'s ability to use Guam if there's an invasion of Taiwan by China. So what was your reaction to that news about the hit on the telecoms of Guam?
It's not news to us in the context of the reality that we are facing constant and continuous cyber attacks against our own infrastructure, as well as against our security apparatus. We've seen figures of close to 5 million attacks on a daily basis. So the majority of them
attacks on Guam or
on
Taiwan?
On Taiwan.
Okay.
The majority of them coming from the PRC. And so it is not surprising that such efforts in attacking our cyber security network are also applied to other partners, to other democracies around the world.
Okay. All right, great. Well, okay, so now we'll take it around the room. John Gizzi from Newsmax.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for having this breakfast. Madam Ambassador, have you had very recent signs from China at all that they are planning some kind of attack? They talk about making Formosa, as they put it, a part of the fatherland again, and speculation is they'll strike within 2 years. Do you have any evidence that they'll do it sooner?
Well, we don't have evidence that there is a very specific timeline, and we're not getting involved in the discussion of specific timelines either. But I think an intention part of the Communist Party of China over the past many decades to incorporate Taiwan into their rule has not been a secret. And we've been facing such military coercion for decades, including around our first ever presidential election in 1996, where live fire missile exercises were also conducted to ultimately coerce the people of Taiwan during a very important milestone in our democracy.
So nothing recent to indicate that China is going to strike?
Well, I'm saying not. There's nothing imminent about the possibility of war. And again, we are doing everything we can to deter and to prevent any potential for conflict. But having said that, of course, there are signs that the PLA is becoming increasingly aggressive, not only in the context of the Taiwan Strait, but in the South China Sea. You mentioned Guam. The Chinese People's Liberation Army that is increasingly capable of having a much more global presence. I think involves a changing geopolitical circumstance that involves not only Taiwan. But from our perspective, we continue to fortify our defenses to the extent that we can continue to deter the possibility of aggression.
And you are satisfied? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, John.
You are satisfied with President Biden's public statements that the United States will come to the defense of Taiwan if it is attacked?
Well, we take commitment seriously, and I think everything we are doing is to continue to strengthen that partnership in a way that supports our ability to defend ourselves. I think in the long run, nothing is ever completely satisfactory. We will continue to build, invest, and strengthen our position.
But you're pleased with what the president has said publicly about this?
Well, again, I think we take commitments seriously. Our partnership with the United States is a very important one and a critical one in terms of gaining a greater international support for our own self-defense.
Right. So about 18 months ago, Taiwan's defense minister said that China would be ready to launch a full-scale invasion by 2025, invasion of Taiwan. Is that still the estimate?
Well, there are all kinds of discussions on timelines, and again, I'm not going to get involved in those timelines on intentions and capabilities. And this is not a static situation. China continues to invest in their capabilities while we also invest in our asymmetric capabilities. And so, ultimately, the goal is to never have a timeline in place.
Right. Michael Martina from Reuters, over here.
You mentioned efforts to ramp up conscription, I believe, next year, and improve the reserve component of the Taiwan Armed Forces. Can you tell us whether the United States or how the United States is helping Taiwan, specifically in the improving Taiwan's reserve forces? Is the National Guard advising or playing any kind of role in that process? And if I could ask a second, more political question. There is some talk in this town, and I presume in Taipei as well, that you may at some point leave and head home to possibly get involved in politics there and maybe even join the DPP ticket. I'm wondering if you could comment on whether that's true.
Well, let me address the first one. That's simple. Getting involved in politics was my former job, and I'm focused on doing my current job as representing Taiwan here in Washington, here in the United States. In terms of our reserves, the reform of our reserves and the extension of the training, the mandatory training for all young men in Taiwan, that will be extended to 1 year as of January next year. This is a very important part of our broader effort to engage a whole of society effort in defending Taiwan. And I think for every young man in our society, unless they choose to join the military as a professional career, they are taking a year out of their life in the beginning of their careers or during their studies in their youth. Some of them are starting new families during this time. I think to make that 1 year meaningful, not a waste of time, is a top priority. And by meaningful, we mean quality training. Of course, we will engage our partners in the United States within the framework of the Taiwan Relations Act on good advice on how best to improve our training and combat capabilities for the young men who will be part of the extended conscription service in Taiwan. In terms of exchanges, cooperation with the National Guard, the National Defense Authorization Act, a couple years ago, there was an initiative by Senator Tammy Duckworth as well as some other bipartisan members of Congress in supporting that. And we are exploring actively some concrete ways in which we can further engage the National Guards across various states here in the United States. I think we have a different system. Our reserves and the National Guard, these are very different systems. But I think a main component of the National Guard as applies to Taiwan is that you have many civilians who are ready to take time out of their civilian life to contribute to the nation and the state's broader defense efforts. And I think a whole of society, conceptually and operationally, how that works in an ideal way, I think is a very important lesson that we seek to continue to engage on in our partnerships with various state National Guards across the country.
Stuck at the exploration stage, or has it moved beyond that to something?
I'm really not in a position to go into the details here, but I think exchanges and continuing cooperation are certainly a part of the NDAA mission. They are also a part of our broader defense cooperation under the Taiwan Relations Act.
Jack Detch from Foreign Policy, to your right.
Madam Representative, you're facing, of course, as you are aware, billions of dollars in backlogs in American arms sales that are supposed to go to Taiwan, including the F-16. I'm just curious how that's hampering perhaps the task of urgent fortification, as you mentioned, and perhaps affecting the readiness of your force to deter a Chinese invasion.
Well, I think the reality over the past few years, and this started way before the Ukraine crisis, and the challenges that the United States is experiencing in the defense supply chain has certainly had an impact on Taiwan. We are working actively in partnership with our American counterparts to find ways of addressing that. I'm told that the administration has also formed a Tiger team to resolve some of these issues down to the factory floor, whether it is in relationship to supply chains, parts and components, delivery timelines, et cetera, or even longer-term contracts and the sustainability or continuation of some of those production lines that would be important in dealing with crises potentially around the world. So, these issues are being addressed. We appreciate that there has also been a lot of bipartisan attention from Congress in supporting all the efforts to reform and to address some of the glitches in the production and delivery of U.S. systems. And we have seen some good progress, actually, in terms of moving up some of the delivery timelines or catching up to some of the expected timelines as well. So some good progress has been made since this issue has been taken seriously. It is being tackled. Having said that, I think we're also looking at other innovative ways to address Taiwan's immediate security needs. The F-16s, for example, we have an existing fleet of F-16s that have to be maintained in top preparedness and readiness. And the parts and components needed for that is an aspect where we feel Taiwan, given our own industry strengths, can also contribute to. So we have established ourselves a F-16 maintenance center in Taiwan with the support of some of the very rapid and expedited reviews of the United States in technology transfers and the authorization process. We're able to produce some of the key parts and components needed to keep our existing fleet as well as future fleets in top shape. So we are also contributing what we can in terms of the broader defense production capacity. And we have confidence also in our own defense and manufacturing capabilities, where there are areas where Taiwan's involvement in our own domestic defense industry can, in a timely fashion, also support the hardware needed in our self-defense. And we will also find ways to work with our American counterparts, including government, but also with industry. There is a recent delegation of U.S. defense industry leaders visiting Taiwan, looking for those opportunities to collaborate and expand the resilience, strengthen the resilience of our defense industries in a timely way.
You talked about process innovations that you're hoping to see to speed up the timeline. Obviously, Taiwan's getting $1 billion in presidential drawdown authority, the same authority the Ukrainians have been getting this year. Are you asking the administration for more in that authority potentially, and what other process innovations do you see that could speed up the timelines?
Well, that is certainly one of the new ways, as authorized by the National Defense Authorization Act, to find different routes in addressing Taiwan's immediate defense needs. And we appreciate, again, the commitment of bipartisan, bicameral members of Congress, as well as the administration, working in alignment to expedite that process, but also in exploring these new opportunities and potentials.
Jeff Earl from the Daily Mail, to your left.
Thanks so much. I heard you say a couple times that you take commitment seriously, so I know it's really hard to walk you off that exact language. But I wanted to ask you again about President Biden's repeated comments on coming to the defense of Taiwan. Do you view that as going beyond U.S. policy in a way that's helpful, or how do you interpret it? Was he just speaking off the cuff in these instances, or do you feel like he's signaling a greater commitment than you were expecting?
Well, I'm not a spokesperson for President Biden, and so what I know is that in the United States you have laws and procedures on whether or not you get involved in international situations. We appreciate that President Biden spoke of his own intentions, his personal commitment in helping Taiwan, and that commitment is practiced throughout the government here as we work on deepening our partnership on the defense side, but also on the economic side. And maintaining Taiwan's economic resilience is also an important part of our comprehensive security. And we appreciate that if our trade agreement goes through in the near future, potentially it could be the first ever trade agreement signed during this Biden administration. And I think that is also an illustration of a commitment to deepen that partnership, to strengthen relations with Taiwan. But I also have to say and emphasize, though, from our perspective, ultimately, we do understand that we have to be determined to defend Taiwan before we can expect anyone else to help us.
And what's your read on the U.S. public and the Congress? We've obviously got the trade agreement moving. Do you feel that the Ukraine war will have caused the U.S. public to pull back in its willingness to support Taiwan?
Well, I think the tragedy is that the Ukraine war has actually generated a lot more attention and interest in understanding Taiwan's security situation, in understanding Taiwan's defense needs. And so there has been a increase in questions, in awareness, in actions, in initiatives to find ways to support Taiwan so that that tragedy will not be repeated in our scenario.
Ian Marlowe from Bloomberg at the end of the table.
Hi, thanks. Representative Hsiao, thanks for doing this. You talked a little bit about the beginning about the U.S.-Taiwan trade talks potentially laying the groundwork for a more comprehensive trade deal in the future. Can you explain what you mean and what sort of trade deal that would look like? And you've also mentioned U.S. support for Taiwan in the World Health Assembly, among other sort of international organizations. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that commitment versus Taiwan being excluded from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which would have, of course, boosted Taiwan's prominence in a regional trade deal that Biden is promoting. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, on the trade agreement, I think what we are looking at is a preliminary agreement that incorporates 5 components of the USTR negotiating mandate. That mandate's available publicly through the USTR website. But what I want to emphasize is that we have, within just a short year since announcing the mandate, the two sides have been very committed to reaching a preliminary agreement. And what I mean by commitment is that usually trade agreements take forever. It could take years, but I think there is a strong commitment from both sides, including some late night, early morning hour negotiations, 2 a.m. and at odd hours across the Pacific, and so we are close to reaching a preliminary agreement over those 5 issue areas, including trade facilitation, small, medium-sized enterprises, et cetera. As we move into the next phase, there are a number of other issues that have already also been mandated, and those will include some more complicated issues like agriculture. These are complicated not only in our bilateral context, but in any trade agreement for any societies around the world. But I think it's important that we demonstrate our commitment to high standards so that this will also illustrate to other major trading partners how seriously we take the synchronization of our trading practices with international standards. We will also, in the next phase, digital trade, the digital economy, labor, environmental standards, et cetera, and these are, of course, some of them were addressed in the USMCA. I think we are looking to ensure that the continuing expansion of our trade agreement will be, again, of high standards. And that will serve to further deepen our trade and economic relationship. One important aspect that the trade agreement will not include at this stage will be customs and tariffs. And the USTR has not sought the negotiating mandate from Congress, and that will need some sort of trade promotion authority from Congress and some congressional involvement. And this is not specific to Taiwan, but just in a broader sense of trade agreements and the direction in which current policy is going. I think we are going to have to move through a second phase of covering the existing mandates before we can further expand in a more comprehensive way to also include that final component. But we will continue to see this in an organic and growing way. Again, pleased to have the likes of a preliminary agreement in place in the very near future. Related to trade is another piece that I can't, again, too important to ignore here, on double taxation. Taiwan is the only top 10 trading partner of the United States that does not have a tax agreement that prevents double taxation. As a result, Taiwanese companies, including many of them in the semiconductor industry that are investing here in the United States, are paying a lot more taxes than other foreign investors here in the United States. And this is unfair. Our companies find this to be very problematic. It's an obstacle in expanding their further investments here in the United States. It is also a tremendous burden on the smaller, medium-sized enterprises that are part of the broader semiconductor ecosystem, as well as the technology ecosystem. I know a lot of attention's put on the giants in the House, on TSMC, Global Wafer, the big companies, and there are CHIPS Act resources, but ultimately, being much more inclusive of all the other SMEs in Taiwan in terms of their access to a fair competition environment here in the United States as they consider expanding their operations here is also critical. We appreciate that Secretary Yellen has, in response to questions from members of Congress, has acknowledged that this is an important issue and that efforts must be taken to address these issues. We appreciate that there have been a number of bicameral, bipartisan initiatives in Congress to also rapidly address this issue. So, there's a lot of momentum, a lot happening in terms of the economic space, and it's an important priority of ours at this point.
Can you also just address that issue of being excluded from IPEF?
Oh, yes. Well, it's very disappointing that we were not included in the first round of IPEC stakeholders. And, I think Taiwan certainly qualifies from an economic standpoint, from an open economy, from the fact that we are a full-fledged democracy, an important part of the Indo-Pacific commerce and trade infrastructure. It was very disappointing that we were not included, and we will continue to advocate on this matter, and we will continue to seek opportunities to not only have a strong bilateral partnership, but also expand to have a presence in the region. And beyond IPEF, we've really been investing many efforts in CPTPP, in having a place in the regional trade infrastructure as well.
Edward Wong from the New York Times, to your left.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you mentioned deterrence earlier, and a lot of the conversation we've had here and that goes on in D.C. is about military deterrence or building up the military for deterrence. But can you talk about other strategies for deterrence that Taiwan might be engaged in? What assurances or other approaches do you need to make in order to deter any aggressive action from China? And following up on the questions about Ukraine, there's some discussion here in D.C. among lawmakers and a few former officials on whether U.S. backing of Ukraine and its giving of weapons aid to Ukraine detracts from the military buildup that's necessary to deter China from any aggressive actions on Taiwan. Could you address that question also?
In terms of deterrence, I think a lot of discussions that we are hearing around town, but also in international settings, beyond the military hardware component of deterrence, involves a number of other areas. One is economic deterrence and the potential economic costs they could have on part of the aggressor. But of course, any war will have global economic costs, and ultimately, it's important to impress on all stakeholders involved that we must do everything possible to prevent this from happening. Another important area of deterrence, I think, is the U.S. partnerships with other regional stakeholders, and the fact that any contingency in the Taiwan Strait will have an immediate impact on others in the region. And it's important that there's a consistency of messaging, not only from the United States, but also from other regional stakeholders as well as global stakeholders. And that is why we appreciate President Biden's outreach to other leaders around the world, including through the G7 summit, through conversations with NATO allies, through discussions with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and other leaders in the region, the need to highlight that peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait is of utmost importance. And we appreciate that statements have been made in the various leadership level summits. But we also understand that beyond deterrence, having that consistency of messaging directly to the PRC leadership is important. And the U.S. efforts to engage other allies and partners as they have opportunities to engage with the Chinese leadership in having that consistent messaging, I think, is also a very important part of our broader deterrence. And as much as hardware is important, I think the will to fight, the will to defend, as we have seen in Ukraine, is also an important component of deterrence. And nobody is ever prepared for war. I mean, this is something that the pain and tragedy of that is something that no one can ever feel prepared for. But I think demonstrating a zero tolerance for aggression, demonstrating a determination to push back on that is also an important component of a broader deterrence. President Tsai, that's why I mentioned this in my opening remarks, the importance of laying out our intentions of keeping a status quo. I think that is also an important message to stakeholders involved, that we will not tolerate any unilateral disruptions to the status quo, although the status quo is in a completely static situation. And so as we are facing all kinds of pressures, coercion, we must also work to fortify our own position so that that status quo may be maintained.
And on the question about Ukraine, like the debate in some quarters in Washington over whether U.S. support of Ukraine detracts from the military buildup that it needs to do to deter PRC aggression against Taiwan.
Well, let me answer that by first saying that Taiwan's defense and security is our top priority. But I think we need to clarify some misunderstandings, and that is the United States is not taking the weapons being produced on the production line intended for Taiwan, not taking them and giving them to Ukraine or anyone else. It's not a subtract from Taiwan and giving them to someone else situation. And the weapons that we have ordered, the weapons that we have acquired, are in a independent track in terms of the production process. And if anything, the increasing awareness on the possibility of aggression on a global level does involve more longer-term investments into the industry that will ensure that our longer-term needs might also be covered. But I also want to say that it's I think pushing back on aggression is the key message that will help to deter any consideration or miscalculation that an invasion can be conducted unpunished, without cost, in a rapid way. We must ensure that anyone contemplating the possibility of an invasion understands that, and that is why Ukraine's success in defending against aggression is so important also for Taiwan.
Gordon Lubold from the Wall Street Journal.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit on your discussion on not only deterrence but also the backlog of arms that have been promised to Taiwan. Are there certain systems that you feel strongly about that you're urging Washington to provide sooner rather than later? Do you have an open request to expand the amount of American training on the island? And I wondered if you could just expand a little bit more on what your industrial base, what your defense industrial base can do to kind of offset this. And I have one more question, but I'll.
On the first question, I think I tried to address that in an earlier conversation, but I think it is being tackled seriously. It is being addressed, and we have made some good progress. Each system is different, in terms of the problems they are encountering. But I think they are being addressed on, down to a micro level, and we look forward to, seeing some continuing progress. As I said, progress is already being made, and I believe that there will be deliveries as we continue this process of putting every bit of attention into, the details of expediting all the deliveries of the systems that we have requested. Sorry, what was the?
Well, I asked too many questions. Can you address, do you have a request to expand the amount of American trainers in Taiwan? And then I guess my kind of other question, a little bit more broadly, is that the U.S. seeks to balance this issue of provocation versus deterrence and all the rest of it. I wondered how you see the issue of provocation and getting arms and other capacity into the island.
On the training aspect, as I mentioned, we have to ensure that our troops are adequately trained. And I think it's especially meaningful for those who will be conscripted rather than professionally joining the military. I think it's important for both, but for all members of society to have the confidence that we are getting the best possible training that is available. And so within the framework of the Taiwan Relations Act, we do seek some good advice and support in our training. And I'm not, this is not the occasion to go into any details of that, but I think training is a very important part that will help boost public confidence in Taiwan, that we are making ourselves better prepared. We are much more fortified. Now, the balance between strengthening our defenses and potential accusations of provocations, I think, when you are when you are in a bad neighborhood and you have, someone in your neighborhood coming yelling at us every day saying, "I'm going to eat you up. You are mine, and if you don't listen, I'm going to destroy you." I think, it's hard to say that we are provoking anyone, by adding our own, defense, whether it's in, alarm systems or, putting on, added defense equipment to our household. I think that is the logic of the way we see our defenses. And we also strongly believe that peace can ultimately be achieved by an open willingness to dialogue on the foundation of respect and equality, but also on having that strength and having the leverage and confidence to engage. And in everything we do, it's a whole balance. We are very often in a position of having to balance, the need to expand our, international activity space, in a need to have more international visitors, the need to fortify our defenses against a potential danger of seeing an accelerated timeline, And it is all a very delicate balance. But I think there are certain necessities that we must do as a means of survival. And those do include fortifying our self-defenses.
All right. So suddenly we're running out of time. We have 10 more minutes, and I've got 4 people. So Jessica from VOA, Jessica Stone.
Thank you for doing this. Jumping on his question of provocation, I wonder what you would say to the China hawks in Congress today about the rhetoric that they sometimes use to indicate that they are very anti-China, but doesn't always help Taiwan in terms of eliciting additional responses from Beijing. And then I have an economics question.
Well, I think across the board, as we engage with both the administration and Congress, I think there is a understanding that the source of threats or instability is generated by the Communist Party of China, and I think as we see in a number of initiatives in Congress, I think there's an interest in deterring the potential for threat. I don't see anyone wanting conflict or advocating the need to provoke a conflict with China. Instead, I see a lot of discussion on the need to strengthen ourselves so that we would be in a position to defend against potential aggression. And I think that continues to be our general discussion across the board. And we also, again, emphasize, in addition to the military and defense aspects, a lot of the important gestures that could be done to fortify public confidence in Taiwan, including our economic resilience, including our democratic resilience. And so including Taiwan in the Summit for Democracies, including Taiwan in a number of international platforms. That's why we've talked about IPEF, and that's why we continue to seek U.S. support for Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations. And we also do see a lot of momentum on that front by members of Congress. And we appreciate that on most initiatives, it's been very much bipartisan.
And my economics question has a little bit to do with what you mentioned about taxes, but also the competitive structure that's set up by the U.S. CHIPS Act between Taiwanese semiconductor chip makers and the desire for the U.S. to build up its own chip manufacturing industry. What, if you could sort of briefly describe the concerns that Taiwan has expressed to the United States and how you would like to see them addressed? I know President Tsai Ing-wen has been public about some of her concerns, but where are those conversations now, and how are you addressing them?
Yeah, well, the chip industry is a very important component of Taiwan's broader economic resilience, and I think Taiwan will continue to be an indispensable and irreplaceable part of global critical supply chains, and Taiwan will remain the most competitive place for making chips in the world, including those advanced chips. But having said that, I think our government in general supports our industry's interest in having a global presence as well, not just production facilities inside Taiwan. And as they consider some new additional investments in like-minded democracies, we want to ensure that those are also successful. They don't distract from the enhanced investments in Taiwan, which the industry is doing as we speak, because Taiwan, again, remains the most competitive place for doing business, especially in the chip industry. And so those investments are continuing in Taiwan. But we want to ensure that any expansion abroad that is a response to some of the customer demands are also successful. And so the policies involved in the CHIPS Act incentives, but also having a tax agreement that avoids double taxation, allowing Taiwanese businesses to compete on fair grounds, allowing them to be able to report back to their shareholders in Taiwan that an investment in the United States is actually profitable. I think that's very important. It's no secret that the cost of production for many of these industry sectors is much more higher in the United States. It could eventually mean that the products they make are a lot more expensive in the United States. But if that's what the customer desires, there are certain made in USA legislative structures that may compel some of that business industry movement by choice. But ultimately, we continue to fortify our own defense industry so that within Taiwan, we can continue to supply the world with the most reliable chips possible.
Okay, Morgan Chalfant, maybe one question?
Yeah.
Quick
Thanks
question.
so much for taking my question. I wanted to ask you a little bit. You mentioned your work fortifying communication systems. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about specifically what you're doing. And there had been some talk from lawmakers, I think, that recently visited Taiwan that there could potentially be bringing, an effort to bring Starlink there. Is that something that your government is considering? Just talk a little bit about kind of what you're doing.
Well, we're looking at, on a broader sense, what has been applied in not only Ukraine, but also in the broader international commercial market. More resilient alternatives and options available for communications. And as we look at them, we also have our legal structures and restrictions within Taiwan in terms of market opening. And so I think we have to look at this in a broader, holistic sense, including domestic markets, our security needs, resilience, and also synchronizing our domestic market space to international advances in modern technology in the communication space. And so these are issues that we continue to address within our domestic legal debates.
Okay, Krista Case-Bryant to your right from the Monitor.
Thanks so much for doing this. On a different topic of the pandemic, Taiwan sent an email to the WHO early on saying it looks like this COVID, well, it wasn't even called COVID at that point, but is being transmitted human to human, and it was 3 weeks before the WHO acknowledged that themselves, and that has led to criticism that China is exerting too much influence over the WHO. Do you see changes that need to be made in the global health structure so that future pandemics can be prevented and or the rest of the world can be alerted sooner, and whether that's structural changes or member countries needing to understand better how China is approaching these topics? I'd be curious in your perspective on that.
Well, we were early in terms of attempting to alert the WHO, by sharing some information we had observed inside China, in Wuhan specifically, and. Unfortunately, our attempts to alert the international system failed. And one reason why we were in a position to share this information at a very early stage is because we went through the very painful experience of SARS way back. And because of SARS, we had put in place a very comprehensive network of monitoring any discussion on epidemics, transmittable diseases. We've gone to the extent of even having annual hospital drills so that we may treat our patients in isolation if we are talking about highly communicable diseases. Now, I think the practice that we put in place prior to COVID-19 helped us weather the early stages of the pandemic as the rest of the world was suffering. But I think now that the world has also been through the COVID-19 experience, there will be new structures in place on a global level, and Taiwan seeks to be part of that. I think what was evident in COVID-19 is that exclusion of any expertise or parties or any information at an early stage had disastrous consequences for the world. And that is why we talk about inclusion, universality as a principle for some of these international institutions. The WHO is one of those priorities we're looking at. We're also looking at ICAO, International Civil Aviation Safety. Again, another one of those international systems where exclusion of a key player will potentially have disastrous consequences for the world. Interpol and others. We will continue to stake those opportunities so that our experts can make meaningful contributions.
So it's now 10 o'clock. Do you have time for one more?
Two more. Little goes down here.
Sorry, just one more. So Kelly Yu from Voice of America.
So thank you, Linda. Thank
Sure.
you, Madam Ambassador, for doing this. So my question is about the election in Taiwan next year and U.S.-Taiwan relations. I was wondering how or whether Taiwan's policy on cross-strait issues is going to change depending on the result, and how the election result is going to affect U.S.-Taiwan relations.
Well, I think in every election in Taiwan, cross-strait issues have always been part of the broader debate. But I think ultimately what's in Taiwan's best interest is to build a unity of views within Taiwan. And we have converged on an interest in maintaining the status quo. That's why I mentioned that in the context that it's the largest common denominator among our political parties in Taiwan. And ultimately, our relationship with the United States must also be sustainable across different administrations, both here and also in Taiwan. I think our society, all polls indicate that there is a strong convergence of views. That is, we want to maintain the status quo. The people want to have orderly and healthy engagements with the people in China, although the people of Taiwan also strongly support the need to fortify our defenses. We need to wish for the best, but prevent the worst. The public also desires good relationships with the United States as well as other like-minded democracies. And I don't think any political party that wants to be electable in Taiwan can go against these trends within our society. And so I think in the long run, we do have a sustainable, stable international outlook that can be carried on regardless of the outcome of elections.
All right. Well, listen, thank you for going 2 minutes over time, and this has been great, really helpful, and I hope you'll come again.
Master Hsiao, nice to see
But
you.
we were
Can I just
on
ask,
time.
what are your concerns about Chinese interference in the January election, cyber or otherwise? And what, if anything, can the Biden administration do to help fend that off?
Well, just briefly, because we're over time, we are very concerned about that. And they've attempted to interfere in all of our previous elections. And there's no reason to have confidence that that won't happen. In fact, there is a lot of political messaging, not only through cyber attacks, but disinformation campaigns, Chinese narratives that are amplified in our society during the political process. So it's an issue that we will continue to address.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, she said, I'm fine, I hope you're doing well. Come see her.